the house that held all the answers. We've walked through this case piece by piece, examining each element carefully, letting the evidence speak in its own quiet voice. And now we stand at a place where all those pieces need to come together, where we have to look at what the totality of the evidence tells us, not what we've been asked to believe, not what the initial narrative claimed, but what the evidence itself, in its stubborn refusal to fit that narrative, has been telling us all along. There's a pattern that emerges when you step back far enough to see it, a pattern that runs through every element we've examined. And that pattern points to something we've been circling around, something we've been building toward through all these episodes. This was never an external event. This was something that happened within a self-contained environment, within the house, within the family. And once you see that pattern, once you allow yourself to recognize what the evidence has been quietly insisting upon, everything shifts. The contradictions resolve. The timeline makes sense. The staging reveals its purpose. And we're left with a truth that's been waiting there all along, patient and unavoidable, in the spaces between what was said and what the evidence shows. Theme 1. The criminal who never had to hurry. Let's start by bringing together everything we know about timing and urgency, or rather the complete absence of urgency in a situation where urgency should have been the defining characteristic. We've examined the ransom note that took too long to write, the tea that took time to brew, the pineapple that required someone to pause, to prepare, to sit down and share a moment that should never have existed in the chaos of a kidnapping. The staging that appears to have been applied hours after the fact when rigor mortis had already begun its work. The 12 hours between when JonBenet was placed in the basement and when she was found. The lawyer who arrived before the investigation had even begun. Every single one of these elements tells us the same thing. Whoever was responsible for what happened that night had time. Not the desperate, compressed time of criminals trying to execute a plan and escape before being discovered. But expansive time, unhurried time, the kind of time you only have when you're not fleeing from anything because you're already exactly where you're supposed to be. Think about what real urgency looks like. Real criminals operating under time pressure make fast decisions. They use whatever's immediately available. They don't pause to brew tea or write 3-page letters or construct elaborate devices from household materials. They grab, they move, they execute their plan as quickly as possible because every second is risk, every moment of delay is opportunity for discovery and capture. But nothing about this case shows that urgency. Nothing about it suggests people operating under the time constraints that external criminals would face. Instead, everything suggests someone who could take their time, who could pause to prepare food, who could spend 20 minutes writing a ransom note, who could wait hours before applying staging elements, who could move through the house, gathering materials, constructing devices, positioning a body, all without the desperate rush that should characterize a crime in progress. And the only way someone has that kind of time, that kind of freedom from urgency, is if they're operating in an environment they control, where they don't have to worry about discovery because they have every right to be there, where they can take as long as they need because there's nowhere they need to flee to, where the house itself becomes both the scene of what happened and the refuge where they can think, plan, stage, manage, all at a pace that would be impossible for anyone operating from outside. Let's examine this absence of urgency from multiple perspectives because it's one of the clearest indicators that this was an internal event rather than an external intrusion. From a logical standpoint, time pressure creates predictable patterns of behavior. When you're under time pressure, you simplify. You cut out non-essential actions. You focus solely on your primary objective. If your objective is to kidnap a child and escape with her, everything you do serves that objective. You don't stop for snacks. You don't spend time writing elaborate notes. You don't construct sophisticated devices when simple solutions are available. You move fast, you move efficiently, and you get out. The complete absence of those patterns tells us the person responsible wasn't operating under those constraints, wasn't worried about discovery because discovery wasn't a threat, wasn't rushing because rushing wasn't necessary. The lack of urgency is evidence of control, of operating in familiar territory, of being exactly where you're supposed to be and having all the time you need to manage what's happened and figure out what to do next. From a philosophical perspective, the relationship between time and guilt is profound. When you've done something you know is wrong, time becomes your enemy if you're trying to escape. Every second that passes is a second where you could be caught, where evidence could be discovered, where the net could close around you. But time becomes your ally if you're trying to manage a situation from the inside. If you can control discovery, control testimony, control the narrative, then time gives you space to think, to plan, to create the story that will protect you when discovery finally becomes inevitable. The person responsible in this case understood time as an ally. They created it by placing JonBenet where she wouldn't be immediately found. They used it to write the ransom note, to stage elements of the scene, to call a lawyer, to gather friends who would serve as witnesses to their distress. They managed it so that when discovery finally came, enough hours had passed that timelines became murky, that biological evidence became harder to interpret precisely, that the story they'd constructed had time to solidify. That relationship with time, seeing it as something to be managed rather than something to escape from, reveals the mindset of someone operating from inside a controlled environment. Someone who understood that as long as they could delay discovery, they could use the intervening hours to build the narrative that would point investigators away from the truth. Psychologically, the ability to function without urgency in the aftermath of something terrible reveals a particular kind of compartmentalization. Most people, when they've been involved in something traumatic, experience a physiological and psychological state that makes calm, methodical action difficult. Your nervous system is activated. Your thoughts race. You struggle to think clearly or plan ahead. You operate in reactive mode rather than strategic mode. But the lack of urgency we see throughout this case suggests someone who had moved beyond that reactive state into something more controlled. Someone who could think strategically even in the aftermath of trauma. Who could plan, construct, stage, write, all requiring cognitive functions that are difficult to access when you're in acute panic. That level of control suggests either exceptional ability to compartmentalize or a situation where the panic wasn't as acute as it would be for someone trying to escape. Where the mind could focus on problem solving because the immediate threat, being caught, wasn't present in the way it would be for an intruder. From a physiological standpoint, the absence of rushed mistakes is telling. When people are operating under extreme time pressure with high stakes, they make errors. They leave evidence they didn't intend to leave. They forget things. They do tasks incompletely or incorrectly because they're moving too fast to be careful. Crime scenes created under genuine time pressure show those signs, the chaos, the incompleteness, the evidence of haste. But this crime scene doesn't show those markers. The ransom note is long but relatively coherent. The staging, while not convincing, was applied with enough care that elements were positioned where they needed to be. The body was placed in a location that successfully delayed discovery for hours. None of this shows the kind of sloppy, rushed execution you'd expect from people operating under severe time constraints. It shows something more methodical, more careful, more consistent with someone who had time to think about what they were doing and execute it without the pressure of imminent discovery. Forensic criminology teaches us that time available to offenders shapes how crimes are committed and staged. And one clear pattern is that offenders with unlimited time create more elaborate staging, more detailed narratives, more sophisticated attempts to control how the crime will be interpreted. They have the luxury of thinking through what investigators will look for and trying to provide it or misdirect from it. The elaboration in this case, the 3-page note, the constructed device, the multiple staging elements, the positioning that delayed discovery, all of this is consistent with someone who had hours, not minutes, to work with. Someone who could take their time because they controlled the environment and could manage when and how discovery would occur. That level of control and time is almost never available to external criminals. But it's exactly what you'd expect from someone operating inside their own home. From an anthropological perspective, the way we move through familiar versus unfamiliar spaces is fundamentally different. In unfamiliar spaces, we're cautious, alert, constantly orienting ourselves. We move carefully because we don't know what's around the corner, what might trip us, what sounds are normal and what aren't. But in familiar spaces, in our own homes, we move with confidence. We know where things are. We can navigate in the dark. We understand the rhythms and sounds of the space. We don't rush because we don't need to. The lack of urgency in this case suggests someone moving through familiar space. Someone who knew where the basement was, where materials were kept, how to navigate the house without fear of getting lost or trapped. Someone who understood they could take their time because this was their territory. Their lack of urgency is evidence of their familiarity. And that familiarity points inward, to someone who lived in that house and therefore had no reason to rush because they were already home. Finally, let's think about this from the perspective of someone who needs time to think. Imagine something has happened. Something you didn't plan, something that's changed everything, something you now need to figure out how to handle. In that moment, what you need most is time. Time to let the initial shock pass. Time to think through your options. Time to construct a story that might explain what's happened in a way that doesn't point to you. The person responsible in this case created that time. They created it by hiding JonBenet where she wouldn't be immediately found. They created it by writing a ransom note that would focus everyone's attention outward and establish a timeline, the 10 a.m. phone call, that would keep people waiting rather than searching. They created it by managing who was questioned and when, by controlling information flow, by establishing a narrative early that would shape how everyone understood what was happening. And they could create that time because they controlled the environment, because they were operating from inside the house with the ability to delay discovery, to stage scenes, to manage testimony. An external criminal can't create time. They can only try to compress it, to do what they need to do and escape before time runs out. But someone inside can expand time, can use it as a tool, can transform it from enemy to ally. We've examined the absence of urgency from every angle, and what emerges is a clear picture. Whoever was responsible for what happened to JonBenet had time, had the luxury of unhurried action, had the ability to pause, to think, to plan, to stage, to manage. And that luxury is evidence of control, of operating in a familiar environment, of being exactly where they were supposed to be. The criminal who never had to hurry was never a criminal fleeing from anything. They were someone already home, using time they'd created to build a story that would protect them when the truth they were hiding finally had to be faced. Theme 2, the pattern that runs through everything. And now let's step back and look at the pattern that connects all the elements we've examined. Because when you line them up, the lawyer's early arrival, the ransom note's intimate knowledge, the phone call that never came, the pineapple and tea, the undisturbed body, the superficial staging, Burke's excluded testimony, you see they all point in the same direction. They all reveal the same underlying reality. This was an event that happened inside a controlled environment, by someone with access and knowledge and time, for whom the primary challenge wasn't escape but management. Management of discovery, management of narrative, management of how what happened would be interpreted and by whom. Every element that doesn't fit the kidnapping narrative fits perfectly into an internal event narrative. Every contradiction in the external story resolves when we accept the internal reality. Every piece of evidence that seems strange or impossible in the context of intruders makes complete sense in the context of someone operating from inside the household. Think about what this pattern reveals. It reveals someone who knew the house intimately, where materials were kept, where the basement was, which room would delay discovery. It reveals someone with time to write, to brew tea, to construct, to stage, to wait. It reveals someone with access to household knowledge, John's bonus amount, family dynamics, which rooms were used and which weren't. It reveals someone who could control discovery, who knew JonBenet wouldn't be found until they were ready for her to be found, who could manage the timeline of the investigation. It reveals someone who could manage testimony, who could exclude Burke, who could call a lawyer before questions were asked, who could create boundaries around what information would be shared. All of those capabilities, knowledge, time, access, control, they cluster together in one place. They all point to the same source, someone inside the household, someone who belonged there, someone for whom the challenge wasn't getting in or getting out, but managing what had happened and creating a story that would point investigators away from the truth. Let's examine this pattern from multiple perspectives because seeing it clearly requires us to look at how all these elements interconnect and reinforce each other. From a logical standpoint, when you're trying to understand what happened, you look for the explanation that accounts for the most evidence with the fewest assumptions. And the internal event explanation accounts for everything. It explains the lack of forced entry, the use of household materials, the intimate knowledge displayed in the ransom note, the time available for staging and construction, the ability to delay discovery, the control over testimony. Every single element that seems contradictory or impossible in the external narrative becomes explainable, even predictable in the internal narrative. That's not coincidence. That's pattern. When one explanation resolves all the contradictions while the alternative requires us to ignore or explain away piece after piece of evidence, the simpler explanation is almost always the correct one. And the simpler explanation here is that this happened inside the house, by someone who lived there, who had all the access and knowledge and time that the evidence reveals. From a philosophical perspective, we have to ask ourselves what it means to maintain a story in the face of evidence that contradicts it. The kidnapping narrative has been maintained for decades despite evidence that doesn't support it. That maintenance requires us to ignore the ransom note's problems, to overlook the staging's superficiality, to accept the missing phone call as unfortunate but not disqualifying, to understand Burke's exclusion as protective parenting rather than information control. But at what point does maintaining a story despite contradictory evidence become a choice to avoid truth rather than a genuine attempt to find it? At what point do we have to acknowledge that the story doesn't fit because it was never meant to fit the evidence? It was meant to redirect attention from it. The pattern we see running through this case is a pattern of misdirection, of creating external explanations for internal events, of staging scenes that point away from what really happened, of managing information so that the truth stays hidden behind a story that, while full of holes, is easier to accept than facing what the evidence actually tells us. Psychologically, the pattern reveals a consistent mindset. Someone thinking about how to manage perception, how to control narrative, how to create distance between themselves and what happened. That's not the mindset of panic, that's strategic thinking, problem solving. Managing a crisis not by responding to it emotionally, but by constructing a narrative around it. And that strategic mindset shows up everywhere. In the decision to call a lawyer before being accused, in the construction of a ransom note that creates a false timeline, in the staging that points to external criminals, in the exclusion of Burke's testimony, in the careful positioning that delayed discovery. Every decision serves the same purpose: create a story that protects the people inside the house by pointing investigators outside it, From a physiological standpoint, the consistency of the pattern tells us something about the state of whoever was managing all this. Because managing requires cognitive resources, requires the ability to plan ahead, to think about how actions will be interpreted, to maintain focus across hours of crisis. That's difficult to do when you're in complete physiological breakdown. But it's possible when you're in a different kind of stress state. Focused problem-solving, operating in familiar territory where your nervous system can maintain enough control to execute plans rather than simply reacting to circumstances. The fact that the pattern is so consistent, that decisions across hours all serve the same strategic purpose, tells us whoever was managing this had sustained cognitive function throughout. They weren't making random panic choices, they were executing a plan, or building one as they went. But either way, maintaining enough control to keep all their choices aligned toward the same goal, protecting themselves by creating a narrative that pointed away from them. Forensic criminology recognizes this pattern as characteristic of staging by someone with a relationship to the victim. External criminals don't typically create elaborate narratives. They don't need to. They can simply leave. But people who are part of the victim's life, who can't leave because they live at the scene or are expected to remain for investigation, they need narrative. They need a story that explains the victim's loss without pointing to them. And they need to control that narrative from the beginning, before investigators start asking questions that might reveal inconsistencies. The pattern in this case fits that profile perfectly. Someone who needed a story, who had the time and access to create it, who could manage its development across the hours before discovery, who understood that the story didn't have to be perfect, it just had to be compelling enough to point investigators in the wrong direction long enough that when contradictions emerged, too much time would have passed for them to matter. From an anthropological perspective, the pattern reveals something about social position and resources. Not everyone could have managed what was managed that morning. Not everyone could have called a lawyer before being accused. Not everyone could have controlled the timeline of discovery. Not everyone could have excluded witnesses from providing testimony. These capabilities come from resources, from social position, from understanding how to work within and around systems of authority. The Ramseys had those resources, had the social position, had the understanding of how to protect themselves legally and practically. And the pattern we see throughout this case is a pattern of someone using those resources effectively. Someone who understood that wealth and position create buffers, create options, create the ability to manage situations that others might not be able to manage. The pattern isn't just about what happened. It's about who had the capacity to manage what happened in the way it was managed. Finally, let's think about this pattern from the perspective of what it hides, because patterns of misdirection exist to draw attention away from something, to create a false focus while the truth remains unexamined. And the pattern in this case, the ransom note, the staging, the controlled testimony, the managed timeline, all of it exists to draw attention outward, to make everyone look for external criminals while the truth waited inside. And that misdirection worked, at least partially. The investigation did look outward, did pursue intruder theories, did spend time and resources chasing leads that went nowhere because they were based on a narrative that was never true. The pattern of misdirection served its purpose. It created enough doubt, enough alternative possibilities that the investigation never fully committed to the simpler, more obvious explanation that the evidence supported from the beginning. We've examined the pattern that runs through everything, and what we find is consistency. Consistency of purpose, manage the narrative, control information, point investigators away from internal explanations. Consistency of method, use resources, use knowledge, use time, use social position to create protective barriers. Consistency of effect, delay understanding, create doubt, Maintain enough ambiguity that the truth can remain hidden behind a story that, while problematic, is less painful than facing what the evidence reveals. The pattern is there for anyone willing to see it. It runs through every element we've examined, and it points consistently and unavoidably to the same conclusion. This was never what we were told it was. It was something that happened inside that house. And the pattern of misdirection, the elaborate story constructed to hide that truth, that pattern itself is evidence of what needed to be hidden. Because you only create such elaborate misdirection when the truth is something you can't afford to have discovered. And the truth in this case was always there, waiting in the pattern, waiting for someone to step back far enough to see it whole. Theme 3. The truth the house always held. And now we come to the end of this journey through evidence and contradiction, through careful examination of what we've been told versus what the evidence shows. We've walked through room after room of this case, looking closely at each element, letting the contradictions accumulate until they become undeniable. And what we find, when we let ourselves see what the evidence has been telling us, is something both simple and unbearable. The truth was always there, in the house. The ransom note was written there. The staging was done there. The body was placed there and left there. The people who knew what happened were there. The person responsible was there. JonBenet never left that house. She was never meant to leave. The kidnapping was a fiction created to explain her absence, but she was never absent at all. She was in the basement while the story was being written upstairs, while police were called and friends gathered and a lawyer arrived, while everyone waited for a phone call that would never come because there were no kidnappers to make it, while the investigation looked outward for criminals who didn't exist. The house held all the answers. It still does. The evidence is there in the materials used for staging, all from the household. There in the intimate knowledge displayed in the ransom note. There in the time available to construct and stage and manage. There in the control over discovery and testimony. There in the familiarity with space and materials and rhythms. Everything about what happened points to someone who belonged in that house. Someone who had access and knowledge and time. Someone who could manage what happened because they were operating in an environment they controlled. Let's examine what this truth means, what it reveals, what it demands we acknowledge about what really happened that night. From a logical standpoint, once you accept that this was an internal event, everything makes sense. The contradictions resolve, the timeline works. The staging reveals its purpose, not to convince investigators, but to create enough doubt to prevent immediate focus on the household. The ransom note serves its function, not to collect ransom, but to point attention outward and buy time internally. The excluded testimony, the delayed discovery, the managed narrative, all of it serves the purpose it was meant to serve, which was protecting someone inside the house from being held accountable for what they'd done. The logic is actually quite simple once you stop trying to force the evidence into the kidnapping narrative and instead let the evidence tell you what actually happened. Something occurred in that house that night, something that led to JonBenet being lost. And the people in the house, whether directly responsible or desperate to protect someone who was, created a story that would point investigators away from that truth. They created it using materials and time and knowledge they had because they were home, and they maintained it through control of testimony and narrative and discovery because they understood what would happen if the truth came out. From a philosophical perspective, we have to grapple with what it means that this truth has been available all along but has remained largely unacknowledged. The evidence was always there. The contradictions were always visible to anyone looking closely. The pattern was always present. But accepting what the evidence showed meant accepting something almost too painful to contemplate. That this child was lost by someone in her own home, in her own family's care. That the people who should have protected her were instead protecting themselves or each other from the consequences of what happened. That truth is hard to face. It's easier to believe in mysterious intruders, in complex conspiracies, in anything that preserves the idea that families are safe spaces and that harm comes from outside. But the evidence doesn't care what's easier to believe. The evidence just exists, bearing witness to what happened. And what happened occurred inside that house, in what should have been the safest space in JonBenet's world. Psychologically, understanding what happened that night requires us to understand that terrible things can happen in ordinary homes. That family dynamics can become toxic in ways that lead to tragedy. That accidents can happen that people feel they can't acknowledge. That fear and shame and denial can lead people to make choices that protect themselves at the expense of truth and justice. We don't know exactly what happened to JonBenet. The evidence tells us where she was and approximately when, tells us she was positioned carefully and left undisturbed, tells us staging was applied to create a false narrative. But it doesn't tell us the exact sequence of events that led to her loss. Was it rage? Was it an accident that escalated? Was it something that started one way and ended another? We can't know for certain. What we can know is that whatever happened, it happened in an environment where the people who should have been protecting her chose instead to protect themselves or each other. And that choice, the choice to create a false narrative rather than face what had occurred, that choice is itself a form of harm. From a physiological standpoint, understanding what happened means understanding that extreme stress can lead to decisions that seem incomprehensible from the outside. People in acute crisis don't always think clearly, don't always make rational choices. The decision to stage rather than admit, to create a narrative rather than face consequences. These might have been made in a state of panic, of denial, of desperate fear about what acknowledgement would mean for the family, and that doesn't excuse the choices. But it helps us understand them as human choices, made by people in circumstances most of us will never face, dealing with something most of us will never have to deal with. The capacity to make terrible choices exists in all of us. Most of us will never be tested in ways that reveal that capacity. But understanding that it's there, that under certain circumstances people can prioritize protection over truth, that helps us understand how something like this could happen without requiring the people involved to be monsters. They were people. People who made terrible choices under terrible circumstances. And those choices led to decades of injustice for a child who deserved better. Forensic criminology teaches us that the simplest explanation that accounts for the evidence is usually correct. And the simplest explanation here is internal event with staging to create external appearance. Everything else, the intruder theories, the conspiracy ideas, the complex alternative narratives, they all require us to ignore evidence, to explain away contradictions, to accept unlikely scenarios because the likely one is too painful. But pain isn't a valid reason to ignore evidence. JonBenet deserves better than a comfortable lie. She deserves the truth that the evidence reveals, even if that truth is hard to face. And the truth is that she was lost in her own home, by someone who had access to her, in circumstances that those closest to her chose to conceal rather than acknowledge. From an anthropological perspective, understanding what happened means understanding how family systems can protect themselves even at the cost of individual members. How collective survival can override individual justice. How the instinct to preserve the family unit can lead to silence, to secrets, to a closing of ranks that prevents truth from emerging. The Ramsey family closed ranks. They protected each other, or protected whoever needed protecting. They created a collective narrative and maintained it despite evidence that contradicted it. They used their resources to manage the investigation, to control what information was available, to create enough doubt that certainty about what really happened remained elusive. That's what families do sometimes when faced with unbearable truth. They protect themselves, even when protection means injustice. even when it means a child's loss goes unacknowledged, her truth untold. Finally, let's think about what this truth means for us. For those of us who have followed this case, who have tried to understand what happened, who have struggled with the contradictions and the unanswered questions. It means we have to accept that sometimes the simple answer is the right one, that sometimes the evidence is telling us something we don't want to hear, that sometimes truth is hidden not because it's complex but because it's unbearable. JonBenet's truth is unbearable. The idea that she was harmed in her own home, that the people who should have protected her instead protected themselves, that decades have passed with the real story hidden behind a narrative that was never true. It's painful, it's difficult, it challenges our assumptions about family and safety and justice. But accepting that truth, allowing ourselves to see what the evidence shows, is the only way to honor JonBenet. Not with comfortable lies or convenient fictions, but with unflinching acknowledgement of what the evidence reveals. She was lost in that house by someone who was home, and the story built to hide that truth has stood for decades, protecting the people who needed protection while the child who deserved protection got none. The truth the house always held is simple. This was never about strangers. This was always about family, about what happens when something terrible occurs in what should be a safe space, about the choices people make when faced with unbearable circumstances, about how fear and shame and the instinct for self-preservation can override everything else, including justice for a child. The house held those answers all along, in its materials used for staging, in its spaces used for concealment, in its timeline that allowed for management rather than requiring escape, in its familiar rhythms that allowed someone to move without urgency, to take time to think and plan and construct a narrative that would protect them when the truth finally had to be faced. We've walked through that house now, room by room, evidence by evidence, and what we've found is what was always there. The truth that didn't need to be complex to be hidden. It just needed to be unbearable, and it is. The truth is that JonBenet never left that house, and the person responsible for what happened to her never had to leave either, because they were already home. And home in this case wasn't safe. It was the place where harm came from, and the place where truth went to hide. Outro. We've reached the end of this investigation. This slow, careful walk through evidence that has been publicly available for decades but rarely examined with the patience required to see the pattern it reveals. We've looked at the lawyer who arrived too early, telling us someone knew they needed protection before there was anything obvious to protect against. We've examined the ransom note that knew too much and functioned not at all, revealing itself as a constructed narrative rather than a real demand. We've listened to the silence where a phone call should have been, understanding that the absence tells us the kidnappers never existed to make it. We've sat with the pineapple and tea, that inexplicable pause that only makes sense when you understand this wasn't a crime of urgency, but something that unfolded in familiar space without need for haste. We've examined the body that never moved, understanding that 12 undisturbed hours tell us about control and timing and someone who could create the space they needed to manage what happened. We've looked at the staging that tried too hard, seeing in its superficiality and theatrical quality the hand of someone performing what a kidnapping should look like rather than executing one. We've listened to the silence around Burke, understanding that excluded testimony tells us what his parents feared he might say. And we've brought it all together, seeing the pattern that runs through everything, the pattern of an internal event managed by someone with access, knowledge, time, and the resources to control how it would be interpreted. JonBenet Ramsey deserves more than the comfortable fiction we've been offered. She deserves the truth that the evidence reveals, even though that truth is painful, even though it challenges our assumptions, even though it forces us to acknowledge that harm came from the place that should have been safest. The house held all the answers. It still does. The answers are there in the evidence, patient, persistent, waiting for anyone willing to look closely enough to see them. And what they tell us is simple, unbearable, and unavoidable. JonBenet never left that house, and the person responsible for what happened to her was never outside those walls. They were inside, they were home. And home in this case is where the truth has been hiding all along, behind a ransom note that never needed to function, behind staging that never needed to convince, behind a story that never needed to be perfect. It just needed to be good enough to keep us looking away from the one place we should have been looking all along. Inside the house, inside the family, inside the truth that was always there waiting for us to be brave enough to see it. Waiting for JonBenet to finally have her story told. Not the story that was constructed to protect the guilty, but the story the evidence has been telling all along to anyone willing to listen. She deserves that much. She deserves the truth. And the truth, finally acknowledged, is this. What happened to JonBenet happened at home. And the people who know the truth are the people who were there, who have carried it for decades, who built a story to hide it, and who chose protection over justice, preservation over truth, silence over the unbearable acknowledgement of what really happened in that house on Christmas night, 1996. JonBenet never left, and the truth never left either. It's been there all along, in the house that held all the answers, waiting for us to finally be willing to see them,